Welcome everyone to episode 8 of the PwC Tech Talks. Today we're going to be discussing quantum computing, particularly its relation to the end of cybersecurity as one example of many that we think the quantum computing field will impact, especially now and into the future. We'll go through a little bit of the past. We'll talk about the applications, the challenges to growth of this sector, and why it's important for business. Now, Alex, why exactly are we talking about quantum computing in this episode? I know you met Kei rather randomly, didn't you?
It's a great question. I mean, like, who doesn't want to be talking about quantum on a Friday afternoon? That's the first thing. But firstly, before we dive into this, I just want to say, usual kind of shout out. Tell us where you're tuning in from. And also, I know that, Jeremy, you've got a prompt here at the bottom of the screen. Tell us, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you know about quantum? Because if you're anything like me and Jeremy, it's very much near the 0 kind of end of the scale. But yeah, so Kei and I actually were connected through our new emerging tech leader, Darshan. And I think we were talking about the originally blockchain, right? And decentralization. And then funny enough, Kei said, well, if quantum computing becomes mainstream, we will have to have a decentralized internet. We will have to have decentralization. They go hand in hand. And literally, this was maybe 5 minutes before the end of our meeting, wasn't it, Kei? And I was like, whoa. We need a whole talk on this subject. So thanks so much for being with us, Kei. Why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
I want to quickly, before Kei does that, to your point, Alex, I want to bring up something on screen, data that just came out yesterday, in fact, related to exactly what you're talking about. Are businesses interested in quantum computing? We did a survey with over 1,000 business and technology leaders in the United States. And we asked them a question about investing in emerging tech over the next 12 months. And you can see on screen here, as you might expect, 58% of respondees talked about artificial intelligence. And, given the hype around AI right now and the excitement around it, that's to be expected. Virtual reality and augmented reality, not forgetting our immersive audience out there. Over a third of respondents said they plan to invest in VR and AR over the next 12 months. 29%, so nearly a third of the respondents said that they intend to invest in quantum computing over the next 12 months. And this really adds further credence to the reason why we're doing this talk. This is important for business, and we're going to find out on this talk why. So as Alex said, Kei, over to you for a little bit of an introduction.
Great stuff. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. My name is Kei Kumar, and I sit in the UK CTO tech team. I got my bachelor's and then my master's in astrophysics and theoretical physics from the University of Manchester, with research in computational physics, low temperature physics, and the cosmic microwave background. And I also have a master's in business and economics from Sheffield, where I applied game theory to negotiation tactics. So very much started off in research and mathematics. But after switching to consulting about 15 years ago, I worked in nanotech and plastic transistor manufacturing. But I've somehow transitioned into spending the majority of my career in applied AI, in simulation and modeling, and more recently in supervised and self-supervised learning. And the commercialization of such emerging technologies. It's not often I get to talk about quantum mechanics, so imagine my excitement as in recent years, quantum computing is becoming a very real thing, and then meeting Alex. And so, yeah, I'm very excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
No, we're super, super excited to have you. So, I mean, there's so many questions that already I want to just spill out at you, but why don't we start from the beginning, Kei, right? What is quantum computing? How is it different to, I guess, traditional computing? Tell us a little bit about that level set for us all.
So, great question to start with, Alex. So computers today have a rich and deep history in using math and physics and chemistry to develop physical systems that can store information in binary forms, right? So ones and zeros. So this is because we can use ones and zeros as true and false, and you can do that in any manner of complex logic. If one is true, or if both are true, or if both are false, or if only one is false, and so on and so on. So classic computers today can perform billions of these logics per second and store petabits of information. Peta, that is 1,000,000 billion binary bits, one followed by a lot of zeros, right? And this form of computing has served us well and will continue to serve us well for a very long time to come. let's take an example. Everyone's talking about generative AI, and at the moment, it's doing amazing things. But these amazing things are built atop a complex mesh of billions and trillions of layers of logic. And it is still bound by those same rules of classical computation. It can only make sense of the world by first breaking it down into ones and zeros and then analyzing them. So modern day computers do many of these logical functions simultaneously because we have engineered computer chips at a micron scale. And maybe we'll make nano chips, maybe we'll make angstrom chips, but the number of transistors that you can fit on a single wafer of silicon is still bound by finite limits. And many of our everyday problems require ever increasing computing power. So everyone wants to use ChatGPT. Everyone wants to know whether it will rain next Friday. Pharmaceutical companies want to build new drugs with more complex diseases. Our entire global financial system relies on modern day computers. So, maybe we're getting close to what life was like 120 years ago when the US Patent Office considered shutting down because they believed they'd invented everything. But you know what? This is where quantum mechanics comes in, and I want to try and explain to you a little bit about how that works. So I have a tennis ball here, right? I can touch it, I can feel it, I can smell it. It's discrete and it's definite. But if you think about atoms in the electrons and the protons and the vast array of subatomic particles that make up this tennis ball, you cannot see them, you can't touch them, you cannot feel or smell them. They do not exist as a discrete thing in a fixed location. You can't tell where they are or where they're going. So they could be anywhere. And this is Schrodinger's cat that everybody seems to hear about in pop culture, but nobody really seems to understand what it means. That's what it really means. So until you look inside the box, the cat is both dead and alive. So until you actually look at the atoms in this tennis ball, they exist everywhere, all at the same time. And it being in any one general location is just way more probable than it being somewhere else. And if you describe this probability as a function in mathematics, you get what many of you will be familiar with, which is called a bell curve, right? So this is the wave function of the subatomic particles. I'm using really technical jargon because I'm sure if you read about quantum computing, you'll come across this, but really it's that simple, right? So until you try and measure, the atoms within this tennis ball, quantum mechanics says that they exist everywhere. But if you put a boundary on it and you define one end as 0 and the other end as 1, that is your quantum bit, really. Except the difference between this quantum bit and your classical computing binary bit is that in a quantum bit, the state could be 1, it could be 0, or it could be any infinitely possible value in between in 3D space. And this feature of it being in all of these possible states at any given one point, at any given time, is called superposition. And that's what makes qubits so much more, so much more different than normal bits.
And qubit stands for quantum bit?
Quantum bit. So quantum bit, qubit. That's it. Interesting. And so I guess it's funny, right? Because when I think of quantum computing, I see the videos that I've seen of the amazing, cool, stack tower things that are being frozen or something. Why do they look like that? Is that because in order for it to have that totally different approach, it physically has to be kind of created in a totally different way?
Yeah, so this is really cool, right? So this is the real cool part, because what I used to do was theoretical physics. We just come up with these crazy concepts, right? And it's the engineers who actually have to go and do it. Now, since we're dealing with these tiny, tiny particles, they're so tiny that what actually happens is that the smallest bit of disturbance in their surroundings actually affects them. So in order to be able to create a qubit that is stable, you have to build a system that is completely disconnected from the rest of its environment. And if you want to build a system with more than one qubit, then you have to get all of these qubits in a system and then synchronize them in a way that then they become completely separated from the rest of the environment. And these synchronized qubits are, in quantum mechanics, what's called entangled, which means you change a little bit of one and it changes everything else. This is very important characteristic of quantum computing. But because you have to completely separate them from the rest of the environment, this is where all of this incredible engineering comes in. So these big structures that you're talking about, until recently, it was thought impossible that a quantum bit could ever be created. But, scientists are like magicians, which is just another way of saying that they are very, very clever at getting around problems. So right now there are 7 or 8 different ways of building a stable system of qubits that can be used to run simple algorithms. And all of this big apparatus really comes down to how can you control quantum particles and keep them in a stable state, more often than not at a very, very, very low temperature. Sometimes you're looking at fractions of a single Kelvin, which is 1,000 times colder than space. So cool.
Yeah. So you mentioned, Kate, about talking about theorizing on this subject. How far back does the theory of quantum computing go? And have we moved on from theory now? Have we created anything practical in the real world right now?
Very good question. So it's interesting, right? So there's lots of different ways in which people think about it. I actually like to think of it in a way to say all computers are quantum computers. The computers that we have today just are in a classical state, are in a defined state, but we won't get into that. So the history of computing goes back 2,000 years. They found they've found relics in the Aegean Sea, that was presented to Caesar, for example. But really, quantum computing really started to come into its own as an idea, mostly after quantum mechanics became a widely accepted idea in physics. And really, it goes back to as recently as the early 90s. And I think I put a slide together, Jeremy, that it'd be great to pull that up, because I wanted to stress that this is really, really recent, right? So it was first proposed by a mathematician physicist called Paul Benioff. And quoting Paul Benioff, it was our every physicist's hero, Richard Feynman, who actually coined the term quantum computing, and he popularized it. And this was really, really recent. This was about 40 years ago, less than 50 years ago. But then it took a really long time for researchers to actually be able to engineer something and really create a system of 2 qubits in the lab. And that was in 1998. So you can imagine how long that's taken, almost 20 years to go from concept to something that's actually real. And then fast forward another 20 years, and that was the first time a quantum computer was built to a degree where it could actually do things better than a normal computer, than our classical computers. And there's a term for that, right? It's called quantum supremacy or quantum advantage. It's probably the more PC term now, I believe. But the idea there was, okay, we've spent all of this money, we've built these massive apparatuses that, like Alex said, you were talking about, these massive machines, and qubits don't stay stable for very long. They're very, very hard and to build, very expensive to run, and they're only like useful for a little bit amount of time. But even then, this machine, for a small amount of time with only 2 qubits, was able to outperform Google's supercomputers. So that was quantum supremacy. And then since then, again, companies like Google and IBM and D-Wave, Rigetti, companies in China and Japan, all over the place, everyone's investing in quantum at the moment. And really the race is on to build stable quantum systems of qubits of greater and greater number. And IBM has announced recently that they're going to come out with Condor, which is a 1,000 plus qubit chip, right? So this is going to be amazing. But really the problem, Jeremy, coming back to your question, is that for these quantum computers to be any real, to have any real impact in our everyday lives, I think they're going to have to be of the scale of 10,000, if not even hundreds of thousands or million qubits in terms of scale. So we're still a fair way away. But I'm very hopeful we're not that far away.
And okay, so fascinating, right? Because I mean, already, I don't know about you, Jeremy, but I'm like so much more now like, oh, okay, this all makes sense, right? This feels not necessarily an alien concept, but actually almost the natural progression of like where computing kind of has to go, right? And so my next kind of like thinking on that trail of thought is, let's say, you know, amazing, this chip comes out end of this year, like we start to see, you know, stabilization in the actual hardware side of things. Like actually this power, I guess, that QC can bring is actually going to be real. Now, as a business, what should I be thinking about? What's the practicalities of that? How is that going to fundamentally change my business? How is it going to change the way I operate? How is it going to change my life as a consumer of the internet and computer products? Like, how is it going to tangibly impact the end users? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I think that's a great question, and it's so relevant, right? Because again, even though I said we're still a fair bit away from having practical use quantum computers, they're not that far away. And the sooner we start thinking about these things, the better off we will be. So I often try and use this analogy of quantum computing and the Wright brothers and their first flight. You know, the first flight didn't last very long. It was a very short flight, and it didn't go very well either. So a fair distance away from, say, a business class flight between Sydney and San Francisco, which is the longest commercial flight, or at least I think it used to be. It might be Singapore to London now. But my point is, it was far away, right? But today we've got companies like SpaceX and Virgin Galactic who are promising to take us into orbit or to the moon and to Mars. So it's a huge jump in tech. And I come from modeling and simulation. And if you take the idea, so there's this idea in modeling and simulation called digital twin, right? Which is a computer simulation of a real world system. And this idea of simulation and really what you use simulations for is optimizing on a given problem is really where quantum computers will come into their own, because we are limited today by our understanding of processes and the computing power is a big bottleneck. So quantum computers could break through all of this, right? And they could unlock secrets of the human body at a speed that would take conventional science decades or even centuries to achieve. You can take other examples, like think about battery tech, for example. Quantum computers could help simulate millions of chemical reactions that may help us find one that's so much better than what we use today, and then we'd be able to build super batteries. Fertilizer production. This is a really interesting one, because today fertilizer production uses up 2% of global energy consumption, because it's based on the same process that bacteria use for taking nitrogen from the air and converting it into ammonia. So that's how fertilizers are made, by replicating that process. But quantum computers could unlock new ways of nitrogen fixing and improve yield of fertilizers. So that way we'll be able to feed all of us, because there's 8 billion of us now already almost, and who knows how many there will be in 20 years from now. Photosynthesis is a great example. We all know what photosynthesis is. It's how plants turn sunlight into sugar and then energy. But what you don't realize is that scientists have spent decades, and we still don't really know why photosynthesis has 100% efficiency almost, because our solar cells that turn solar light into energy, they're only about 20 to 30% efficient. So imagine how our world would change if we had nearly 100% efficient solar cells that could then store energy in these super batteries that and all made real because of quantum computing.
Yeah, truly amazing stuff. And really appreciate you expanding on that, Kei. What about cybersecurity? Because I know that regardless of whatever industry you're in, every company, every size, all over the world, cybersecurity is certainly a concern. And we need to be connected to the internet, and that brings with it hazards and dangers. Now, in order to protect us, tell me if I'm wrong here, Kei, but we effectively use a single type or a single group of algorithms that are all based on the same mathematics. Is that right? And then how does this relate to quantum computing and its potential to impact that?
Yeah, great question, Jeremy. So let's get into this, right? Because data security is very interesting. And in terms of impact of quantum computing on data security will be immense. It will be massive. It will completely change everything around. And I think really to understand that, we should probably understand how modern day encryption works. And it's great that you brought it up. And I think I put a slide together on factorization, because really like you said, Jeremy, all of our encryption today is, if you dumb it down, this is an oversimplification perhaps, but if you dumb it down, it really is just based on very simple arithmetic rule that all positive non-prime numbers can be broken down into a product of prime numbers. So let's take an example, 22, right? We know 22 is 2 times 11. So there we go, 2 times 11. We can take a look at another one of these examples, right? Let's take a slightly bigger number, 1568. You can actually break that down into a series of prime factors.
Alex, we're testing you quickly. What are the prime factors of 1568? It's actually quite a tough one.
Yeah, so it's 5 2s and 2 7s, right? But they're all prime numbers. But again, you know what? If you were a math whiz, maybe this would still be slightly hard, but not very hard. But there's only so much we can do with our human brains, and there's only so much we can do with our fingers and calculators. But what if your number was absolutely massive, like thousands of digits?
I mean, I don't think I can even say this number. There's no English word to describe this number, is there?
Yeah, it's a Googleplex of numbers. Absolutely. So, and the idea really behind today's encryption is it works on generating these really, really large numbers at random and breaking them down into smaller primes. And then some of these smaller primes you can use as what are called keys. You can have private keys and public keys. So when you encrypt something, you generate these public and private keys. Public keys get transmitted with the data, and the private key is kept secret. And then only those with a copy of the private key can decrypt the data that you have. That, in a nutshell, is how encryption and decryption works today.
So what you're saying, Kei, if I've got this right, in a simplified fashion, the basis of our entire cybersecurity all over the world, it hinges on being able to break down a massive number into its prime factors. And that's easy to do when you have the prime factors to begin with and you get to the large number. But it's really hard to do when when a computer gets given or we get given a large number and we're trying to find those prime factors, because that requires a lot of processing power and is really, really tough.
That's exactly right. And to be fair, I don't want to be alarmist about this, right? The mathematics, the encryption algorithms that are actually used, they are pretty clever, right? You can't even if you knew the algorithm, you couldn't solve it unless you knew all of the keys. So it's really good, right? Because let's give you an example, right? If you had let's say a digit with let's say a few thousand numbers, right? It would take a classical computer today, a supercomputer today, it would take maybe tens of thousands of years to hard code and find all of the permutations and combinations to find that private key. And which is why it's really good. So, pro tip, long passwords, right? But the problem is, because supercomputers are still limited by binary operations, even the most powerful supercomputers, can't decrypt them, and that's great. But then this clever guy comes around in the early 90s called Peter Shor. He's a mathematician, and he stuns the scientific community by defining a quantum algorithm that could potentially factorize any number, no matter how big it is, using quantum mechanics. And this incredibly, well, I can't find words for it, right? This is absolutely a different way of thinking about how you factorize a large number. And it completely reduces the number of steps that are required. And it's still got lots of classical functions in it, but it's got one or two quantum mechanical functions in it. And, it was amazing as a theoretical exercise. But to run a quantum mechanics operation or algorithm, you need a quantum computer, and those will never exist, right? Right? Actually, a fully functional quantum computer with a few thousand stable functional qubits could break any decryption that we have, encryption, decryption that we have, in a matter of minutes. Wow. So yeah, the impact could be absolutely immense. I mean, I'm not saying, to Alex's point, right? Quantum computers are really big, they're really expensive. and they're really difficult to maintain and run. So it's not like every hacker in the world is going to have one. So don't want to be alarmist about it, but this is really, really important. And I just want to quickly touch on Web3, because decentralization is so cool, because if quantum computers make any kind of computational task menial and instantaneous, right? So the only way to get around that is to say that, we're going to take computation power out of the equation. Decentralization of the internet and data means that access to the whole is no longer about computational capability. It's about permission. So you could have the best quantum computers, but if you don't have the permission to look at it, you won't even be able to solve it to get to the data. And I think this was the conversation that Alex and I were having a few weeks ago that led to this whole session. But yeah, Web3 quantum computing will have to go hand in hand.
And yeah, I'm really glad you touched on that, because firstly, it brings us full circle to where this conversation, first started. But also, it's quite nice because, I think you started talking about like Gen AI, and like obviously you've been doing applied AI for a long time, QC, decentralization in Web3 and blockchain. And I think the bigger picture that we're always talking about on this series is the fact that actually what we're seeing is all of these emerging kind of like tech trends that are seen as their kind of own little silos are all converging, and they all play a part. And actually, I know that we're running out of time, but want to give a quick shout out to our next episode, which is going to be all around the essential 8 technologies in emerging tech that you should be focusing on in 2024, because it does talk to that story. It's like, it might be all about Gen AI right now, might have been all about the metaverse before then, it might be about quantum computing like in a couple of years, but actually what we need to be considering is how they all fit together. And thank you so much, Kei, for coming on and for kind of, giving us that quantum 101, because I feel like I could go have a conversation with someone and understand it a bit better.
And who would have thought that we'd make a connection between quantum computing and Web3 decentralization at the end of this talk? It truly does play to the convergence point, as you mentioned, Alex. Before we wrap, a final thing to say: we did intend to have Arit on the call as well. He was listed on the original post. Unfortunately, he was feeling a bit sick today, so we wish him all the best. But Kei, we really appreciate you being here, and thank you so much for filling the gap there and taking this all on yourself to explain to us the details of quantum computing in such a simple manner. I'm sure everyone really appreciates it. And so thank you all for listening. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you for the comments, everyone. We've got a few up on screen here. We will catch you next week or in 2 weeks' time for a talk about the Essential 8. See you next time.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.